Yes, sir.
All right, why don't we kick this off? Good morning, everyone. I'm John Goldberg. I'm the founder of Reputation Architects, and I'm pleased to welcome everyone to our webinar today, exploring the legal and reputational impact of political and social activism by employees. I'm fortunate today to be joined by two of my favorite legal colleagues. We've shared similar stages before, Kathleen Connolly and Lisa Jingaleski from Lindaberry McCormick. Kathleen's a partner in the firm, specializing in employment law, workplace investigations, and helping clients make employee and workplace decisions that advance their business interests, mitigate legal and compliance risks. Lisa is a member of the firm's labor and employment group and advises clients on a broad array of matters, including employment discrimination, harassment, wrongful termination, workplace accommodations, and federal and state legal compliance. Just to set the stage and tee up our discussion today, I don't think any of us needed to see the aftermath of George Floyd's killing or the events of January 6th to recognize that political and social activism by employees and the legal and reputational issues they raise for employers are continuing to expand rapidly and will only do so going forward. Workers are speaking up individually via social media. They're coming together en masse, both on and offline, to address issues that impact them and their communities and broader society. That research shows that the majority of employees, and that's across the board, but millennials in particular, believe they have a right to make themselves heard about issues that are important to them. More than 70% of them believe they can drive meaningful change by taking a stand on political and social issues. And still more than that, feel that they have an even greater capacity to change the world for the better than the organizations and business leaders that employ them. The fact that 8 out of 10, I was astonished by this number, the fact that 8 in 10 employees acknowledge they know they are likely risking their jobs when they speak out publicly on issues, but it doesn't deter them from doing so. And they have no hesitation about taking stands against their employers because they know that the public is concerned about the very same issues that they are. Thinking of a couple of examples, when employees at Wayfair walked off the job after learning that the company had sold furniture destined for ICE detention centers, they knew they had customers and investors on their side. The same was true with workers at Whole Foods last year who protested for the right to wear Black Lives Matter masks and later filed a class action suit alleging retaliation against employees who oppose the company's dress code. We'll be getting into that issue in a little bit more depth in a couple of minutes. So our focus today is on what employers need to be thinking about and doing in this environment from the standpoint of protecting our business interests and our relationships, maintaining effective workplace cultures, staying on the right side of employees and the law, and my particular area of interest, avoiding the kinds of generally self-inflicted reputational firestorms that can occur when organizations get any of these things wrong. We've tried to leave some time at the end of the session for questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A box as we go along. If it appears there's anything that requires immediate attention, we'll try and take those questions and knock them off as they come. If not, we will address them toward the end. So with that, Kathleen, why don't you start us off discussing our first set of issues, which pertain to employees' First Amendment rights and where they begin and end?
Yeah, thank you, John. First of all, I just want to say I find it somewhat interesting that we're giving this presentation on the day following Dr. Seuss finding himself a victim of the cancel culture. I know I have to go up in the attic and retrieve some of those books and see what this hubbub's all about. But it's just another example how this is really impacting us increasingly in every aspect of our lives, including in the workplace. And it's not going to cease for quite some time. So one thing that I find, there's a large degree of misconception out there about First Amendment speech rights. If you work in a private sector, but for a private sector employer, you have no First Amendment speech rights in your place of employment. First Amendment speech rights only attach to conduct for a public employer, where you have some speech rights if you work for a governmental entity, or in public places. But when we talk about a private place of employment, there are no First Amendment speech rights that attach. So everyone who works for a private employer has to remember that. So we have two examples here on the screen. The gal on the left side of the screen, you can't quite tell what she's doing, but that happens to be the presidential motorcade that is driving by, and she lifts her hand up and flips the bird to the presidential motorcade. And it happened to be President Trump's motorcade. She found herself fired for doing that because her employer said, you know, we're a federal contractor. We don't like the fact that you did such a disparaging, disrespectful thing to the presidential motorcade, and she got terminated. Her argument that she had a free speech right to engage in that kind of conduct on her off time did not save her from getting terminated because she has no free speech rights at her place of employment. Her employer can say, take your free speech rights elsewhere. On the right side of the screen, we have another gentleman who got himself a bit caught up in this. The young man on the left side of the picture, you might recognize, that's Kyle Rittenhouse. And he was a young individual who was accused, tragically, of shooting two individuals and killed them during the riots in Kenosha. Now, the young man standing next to him on the right side of the screen got captured in this picture in a protest in Kenosha. Now, this young individual is not engaged in any violent conduct at the time. This preceded the Kyle Rittenhouse's conduct, but he was caught in this video, and his employer got wind of the video and that he was present at that white supremacist riot. That's what it was being tagged as. And he got terminated. Well, yet again, here's another clear example of an individual engaging in off-duty conduct where the employer is free to say, well, you know what? You're free to do what you want in your own time, but it can have consequences to your workplace. And we don't like the fact that you were out there appearing to support these kind of viewpoints. So those are just two very public examples of where people found themselves on the short end of the stick because they thought they could go out and speak freely without suffering consequences at work. Now, I just want to give some caution. Just because there are no free speech rights at work doesn't mean that employers shouldn't be very measured and very even-handed when they tread into the area of sanctioning or punishing political speech in the workplace. It's a fine line that we're going to have to deal with. And I think employers have to remember they've got to be a little bit fair about it. And I think as we go forward, we'll illustrate a little bit more how employers do have to tread softly if they want to navigate these waters and come out the other end as best as possible. Lisa?
Sure. So along those same lines here, we have a hypothetical. This was actually stripped directly from the headline, so it may have been something that you have read in the papers. But we had an employee who on a company chat engine made the comment here, we named her Sarah, Capitol Hill rioters are Nazis, they're scary, they don't belong anywhere, particularly at this company. A few other people A few other employees chimed in. And then we had another employee come up and say that they were feeling uncomfortable. They went to HR and they said that they felt like they were uncomfortable. It was creating a hostile work environment to see this dialogue taking place on a company's chat engine. The employee who made the initial comment, Sarah, who happened to be Jewish, was terminated. So what are her rights here? As Kathleen mentioned, there are no First Amendment protection rights in the private sector of the workplace. So this employer could lawfully terminate Sarah for engaging in this type of dialogue, especially using a company chat engine or chat room. What's interesting to note, however, is that Sarah was Jewish and she is a member of a protected status. So she may have a potential discrimination claim here, especially if the other employees who are also engaging in this type of conduct and this type of dialogue were not Jewish and did not suffer similar adverse consequences. The company has come forward and said that Sarah was terminated, and they cited to quote patterns of behavior for this termination. So that's a pretty vague comment. We don't know exactly what that means. As lawyers, we can kind of read between the lines here and say, okay, there are probably some other personnel issues and there's probably some other, a history here in her file that they felt leading up to this point, and with this additional engagement, this additional dialogue led to her termination. So they had a legitimate basis for terminating her. But it's important to know that while employees do not have this First Amendment protection in the workplace, if an employer does decide to take adverse action, that they do so consistently amongst their employees.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, you know, whenever you're going to move to take serious discipline against an employee, you should really consult with counsel, because you really have to do a proper vetting to make sure the individual isn't in a protected class, and you may be walking yourself right into a discrimination lawsuit without even realizing it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So another separate part that came from this is we later learned that the company attempted to handle the situation internally by engaging in, I don't know if you want to call it an empathy town meeting within the workplace, or a circle, basically a forum where the employees could come together and have a discussion about how they were feeling about this and what could possibly go wrong in that environment, right? I think, and John, I'm sure you have some comments on this. I think it was well-intentioned to try to bring the employees together and have a dialogue about this. However, in doing so from a legal perspective, it's really important to have guidelines and parameters in place, because you can't control what people are going to say, and you cannot control how it's going to be interpreted. So just like we had this exchange taking place on a work chat engine, you're having a similar exchange possibly taking place out in the open in a meeting room. Obviously we're in COVID, or, you know, on a Zoom call. And you could, in an attempt to make employees feel better, create a situation where you're having even more people complain and come forward based on comments that are made in that particular forum.
There could be a fist fight.
Right. You know, from where I sit, from a reputational and internal culture standpoint, in these kinds of situations where there's tension, controversy within an organization, and giving employees an opportunity to express what they're thinking and feeling, and, you know, share the concerns, even just to vent about what has happened and talk about how it's been handled, and perhaps what everyone could have done differently going forward. It can really go a long way, not just toward lowering the temperature in an organization, but also perpetuating, fostering a culture of openness, inclusiveness, and respect. And, you know, in a lot of sense, employees expect their companies to understand and care about the things they're worried about, the things they're concerned about, the issues that affect their lives and their communities. I saw a lot of this last year. during the Black Lives Matter protests, where organizations of all sizes were really struggling. They felt the need to communicate externally, to say something about what was going on in society, in the community, and so forth. But they became paralyzed trying to figure out what to say, what would be safe, what wouldn't offend, what wouldn't be divisive, what wouldn't be seen as virtue signaling. And in so doing, in focusing so much and being paralyzed trying to figure out what to say outside, they overlooked an important opportunity and really an even more essential audience, and that is engaging their own employees in discussion to find out what they're thinking and feeling. As I said, employees expect their employees to understand and care about the things, what affects them. And, I spent a lot of time with clients on these issues, and what they found when they finally kind of broke out of the paralysis and we were able to get them to engage with employees in a controlled and proper way, employees really guided them and really helped them figure out what they can say externally and how to do it safely without crossing any lines. But as Kathleen and Lisa said, getting the roles right and getting the ground rules right is crucial. Things go off the rails very quickly when an organization tries to exert too much control about the format and what's discussed and who guides and what happens with the contents of the discussion after it's over. In my view, when you do these meetings, it's really a time for a company to step back and listen and learn. And that's really a good way to also avoid getting into any legal quagmires as well. So if a company has a DE&I working group or a culture committee, asking them for input on how to engage the broader workforce and then empowering one or the other or both of those groups to kind of set the agenda and lead the discussion can help build trust and demonstrate that the company cares, that the company is ready to listen and learn. But of course, obviously, there needs to be clear agreement up front on the basic rules of decorum and respect, just to control those parameters and avoid any legal repercussions after.
Yeah, and to further John's point, if a company decides that they do want to have some kind of forum, a lot of companies don't have anybody internally who's equipped to facilitate that discussion. But there are plenty of people like John or other people out there, professionals, who know how to navigate these thorny issues to ensure that participants feel that their viewpoints are respected, while also ensuring that the focus and the tone of the discussion remains professional and respectful at all times. Mm-hmm. And it's a bit of a high wire to walk, but make sure you get the right individuals involved in that process if you want to undertake that kind of exercise.
In more than a few of those cases last year, we helped clients go out and find authors and academics, third parties who had public points of view on these issues, were already speaking out in the media, and would be willing to lead these sorts of discussions with employees. And I think employees respected that the company went out and did that and recognized that having a neutral third party at the front of the room, not only demonstrated that they can trust the company, but it also improved the quality of the discussion and what came out of it. So, third parties can be very helpful in that regard. So let's turn to our second hypothetical, in which an employee retweeted a widely discredited fake image that circulated during the 26 campaign that purported to show Hillary Clinton in blackface with the statement you see here. Lisa and Kathleen, do you want to take us through the legal implications?
Well, I mean, this is off-duty conduct. Does the employer have a legal obligation to do something about it? Not necessarily, but should they? Well, that's a bit of a different question. Here we have a tweet that is inherently racist and offensive because it depicts the blackface, which is known universally to be unacceptable in today's culture. So could that impact the workplace, even though it's off-duty conduct? Well, sure it could. You could have members of the Black community at work, and now they're having to work with this individual who posted this offensive tweet. Albeit it was political in nature, it also had that inherently racist image attached to it. So the employer, I think, would be well within their rights to address this issue, to facilitate collaborative relationships at work and smooth over this offensive tweet. Also, the company may not want to be deemed as sanctioning or not taking issue with employees who are out there engaging in such offensive behaviors. But what should the punishment be? Okay, should it be a termination in a situation like this? I would think that would be going a little too far in this situation, but I think the employee could be spoken to and reminded about the company's internal policy that prohibits incidents of racially offensive behavior. And I think the employee should be reminded that even if it's on their off-duty time, what they say off-duty could be hurtful to people that they work with and could be hurtful to the company's reputation. So the employee could be reminded to please refrain from engaging in those kinds of public tweets and warned that, if they don't do so, there could be additional disciplinary action in the future.
And this is a good reason why every organization needs to have a very clear, very explicit policy on social media and how social media channels are to be used both in the workplace and in employees' lives outside the workplace, because of course the smartphone has, for better or worse, blurred that bright line that used to exist between our lives at work and our lives outside of work. And that's created a huge array of risks for organizations. So I always advise clients, first, you need to have a policy on social media. That's pretty much universal. But if it's only given to employees when they receive their employee manual, when they join, or maybe they're reminded once a year, it really helps to remind employees periodically. And if this issue had become public within the company, it's an opportunity, it's a teaching moment and an opportunity to, without calling out a specific employee or set of issues, to remind employees of their responsibilities to the company, the importance of protecting the organization's reputation and how their actions reflect on the company, just as the company's actions reflect on them.
Yeah. Well, now, and it's interesting, you mentioned, the importance of a policy. Most employers have a electronic communications policy, social media policy. But a couple of years ago, I decided, because I prepare a lot of handbooks for my clients. And I decided we also need an off-duty conduct policy. And I crafted one on my own. And it's a reminder to employees that your off-duty conduct can have consequences at your workplace. And it's a check for employees to realize, just because it's on your own time, on your own device, doesn't mean that it's out of bounds for us as an employer. And I think in fairness to your employees, you need to remind them of that so they're not blindsided thinking that, oh, well, I'm off duty. What does it have to do with work? So I think those of you who might not have those kinds of policies, I suggest you want to get one, because in fairness to your staff, they should know that before they start opening their big mouths and sending out a tweet that they shouldn't have sent out.
Absolutely. Kathleen, how would it be any different in terms of the law and both employer and employee responsibilities if this were the message that were posted versus the one we looked at a minute ago?
Well, I think this one's very different. First of all, it's not work-related necessarily. Also, it seems to be a purely political opinion. You may or may not agree with it, and the company may or may not agree with it. They may think it's gone too far. But again, it's a purely political opinion. There is nothing inherently racist or discriminatory about the comment. It's just about Hillary Clinton herself. And I think, yes, we've said before, an employer, if they wanted to, they could say, well, we don't like the fact that you disparaged her so much. We're Hillary supporters. You're out of here. Yes, they could do that. But, you could be facing some unintended consequences by doing that. What I mean by that is employees have a lot of political opinions. So if you happen to have somebody who does a similar tweet, but it's about the opposition, maybe it was about the Trump administration, what are you going to do about that person who made a very similar comment? Shouldn't you be treating both sides fairly and equally? And if you don't, you may have some people in the workplace saying, oh, I see how it is. It's only if I'm on one side of the political fence that I can talk. If I'm on the other side of the political fence, I can't say anything. So I think you have to be a little wary about jumping on every political commentary that you as an employer might find not appropriate. But as long as it's not touching the workplace directly, I think maybe you want to think about having a hands off in some situations. Unless, of course, there's some correlation to the workplace. So, for example, if this were a person who worked for the Democratic National Party and they tweeted that, well, then you could see, well, hold on a second. You're supposed to be supporting this organization and you're tarnishing the reputation of one of our leaders. Well, that would be a very different situation. But I think in this situation, if it's just generically, I think that's something you'd want to let go. Lisa or John, you might have a difference of opinion, but that's how I view this one.
I agree with you, Kathleen. I think this is a difficult area for employers to navigate. And if they do take a position, like in this specific example, and as exactly as you said, and they didn't take a similar position if a comment was made about the Trump administration or whatnot, you ultimately could be creating an environment of friction in the workplace and where people are feeling like outcasts. And if they don't believe in one side versus another, they can't speak up and they retreat as a result. So I agree with you. In this situation, it's different. There isn't a discriminatory or racist component to it. It's simply a political statement. And I don't know that the employer should take any sort of action under these circumstances.
Yeah, and I agree with all that's been said. Here's another case ripped straight from the headlines back in January. And we've been talking so far about what happens when employees take a political view. But what about when the company itself or when the CEO does the same thing? There's the same set of legal and reputational potential consequences that come up. Back on January 5th, interesting timing, it was right in the middle of the Georgia Senate runoffs. The Pizza Inn chain, which is a chain of about 250 restaurants, mostly across the South, put out a press release on the news wires in which its CEO endorsed claims of rampant voter fraud in the November election, called for an audit of the vote before the inauguration, and laid out a list of other election security measures. And reaction on social media and by the news media. I was first tipped off to this by an editor who called me to comment. Thankfully, he agreed to put my initial, what the actual, what response, when I pulled this up online, he agreed that that was off the record. The reaction was swift, which led the company to pull back the press release on January 6th. I'm not sure on January 6th if anyone was really looking for it and reading it at that point. Now, does the CEO, do the executives have the right to express political views? Absolutely, especially when those views are aligned with the company's business interests and purpose in society. I'm pretty hard pressed to find a nexus between alleged voter fraud and pizza. And honestly, the only thing that kept this to pretty much a one-day story for the company was timing. It was the events of January 6th, ironically, that saved the company and the CEO from a larger reputational issue and ridicule on the on the 11 o'clock shows at night. What you don't want to do as an organization, what you need to avoid, and pun is unintentional, you don't ever want to bake yourself into a corner by taking a political or social position unnecessarily that exposes the company to risk. Now, you can be sure that when a Nike a couple of years ago was deciding whether to embrace or to distance itself from Colin Kaepernick, it had tons of consumer data and had modeled to the nth degree how the decision to support Kaepernick, support take a knee, don't support, how the decision either way would affect sales among various segments of its consumers. I don't think Pizza Inn was engaged in those sorts of careful calculations, but it could have saved itself a lot of heartburn had it asked itself a few questions. And I think organizations, whenever you're considering taking a public position, stop, think. Warren Buffett of Berkshire Hathaway implores his managers to apply something called the newspaper test. How would this look if it appeared tomorrow on the front page of your local newspaper? Ask these questions. Do we have a clear purpose? What is our purpose for taking this position, and what do we hope to achieve? Have we fully thought through the risks, and does our greater purpose in doing this outweigh them? Here's an important one these days. Is our motive for posting, is it pure? Or are we engaging in virtue signaling or advancing a personal rather than a business agenda? And all importantly, and this is one organizations miss all the time, what are others in our industry saying and doing around the same topic? Because if the rest of your industry, if your peer group are conspicuously silent, it's a good sign you need to think a bit more about what you're planning. But Kathleen, why don't you touch on some of the legal risks here?
Well, in this one, I don't see any legal risks against them because, the impact in the workplace would be simply that individuals who may be politically on the other side of the fence may feel a sense of alienation. But political affiliation is not a protected class. We're getting to the point where maybe it has to be, but as of now, it is not a protected class. So the fact that they're feel not in solidarity with position taken by management on a political issue is not going to give them any protection in the workplace. They can't claim that they're subject to an offensive work environment because the CEO put out a statement that they're politically and morally they find offensive. No legal claim there. But I did want to, I pulled this story up and I found the CEO's statement somewhat interesting because he seemed to go into this, I guess, with his eyes wide open. He said, quote, We fully understand the risks of wading into such heated political waters, but we believe some things, such as America's election integrity, are too important to stand by silently. Pizza Inn respects citizens' rights to agree or disagree with us, boycott us, or visit us in solidarity. So, boy, he seemed to fully appreciate that this could blow up in his face. It'd be interesting to see whether he really got hurt sales-wise, but kind of an extraordinary statement for him to take on such a personal viewpoint and make it frontline in his business. But hey, that's his right to do, I suppose. But boy, that picture is making me awfully hungry. It looks good.
I just did the same thing. We actually just had a question come up. Wouldn't this have been a decision for the board as opposed to a unilateral decision for the CEO?
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, generally, yes. At least making sure that the board is aware of the direction the CEO is taking and communicating a position, because there is no sunlight between the CEO's interest and the company's interests, despite how they may think it's perceived. So if the CEO is speaking on a political issue, that becomes the company's position. So yes, the last thing boards want to have happen is to be blindsided by something like this. And it's really to the CEO's benefit to discuss this with the board, because they may have a very different point of view. And in most cases, a CEO serves at the board's pleasure.
And they may just want to be silent on it. They may say, we don't need to wade into this. We need to sell pizzas. That's all we need to do.
If you're a Dominion or you make voting technology, it's very different than if you deliver pizzas. Again, the nexus between the issue and the company's business and purpose is really what's critical here. Moving along to our next bucket of issues, which have to do with protections for legal off-duty conduct.
Yes, I'm actually going to take this one. This is, while there are no First Amendment protections in the private sector of the workplace, there is certain conduct or speech that, if it rises to lawful off-duty conduct, may be subject to protection. And that's because under Section 7 of the National Labor Relations Act, there are limited speech protections for those who engage in what's called concerted activity. And that's really when you have two or more employees who come together to discuss the terms and conditions of the workplace. And that can be by telephone, it can be informally at the lunch table, it can be formally during a meeting, it can be by social media. It's simply having two or more employees discussing the terms and conditions of the workplace. So hours, wages, other working conditions. If you have an employee who participates in a rally having to do with sick leave, that would likely extend to protection under Section 7 of the NLRA. We also have on here that there are some states, and nearly 30, that have actually codified this into formal laws that prohibit or protect lawful off-duty conduct. We have here that Colorado protects any form of lawful off-duty conduct. 11 states, including New York, prohibit discipline for those who engage in political activities. And of course, there are exceptions and carve-outs if that activity conflicts with an employer's business. But we're seeing the law kind of move in that direction, and it's important to note. And I think, John, you have some hypos that give us some examples of how this would play out in the workplace.
Indeed, we do. Why don't you lead us off?
Okay, I just want to make a comment, tagging on what Lisa just said. Everyone needs to make sure before you contemplate disciplining an employee in connection with any political speech off-duty, you better make sure whether or not your state has the off-duty conduct law and what the parameters of that are. New Jersey doesn't have it yet, but just make sure you're not in a jurisdiction where that may be the case. Okay, so here we have somebody who sent a message to coworkers, presumably maybe even on the company system, that says anyone here who doesn't support John Doe for Congress is an effing idiot who doesn't deserve to work here. He supports increased minimum wage and employee rights, so get with the program or get out. Now, there's two sides to this issue, okay? First of all, it's articulating a political opinion that is not just kept to the workplace, but this individual is bringing the political opinion into work and suggesting that people who don't agree don't deserve to have a job there. So that's going to create a lot of friction with those individuals who might not agree politically and want to support John Doe for Congress. So I think the employer would be well served to kind of look at this issue and say, well, hold on a second, everybody deserves to work here, not based upon who you support politically. However, this discussion then does tread into a different area. When this individual goes on and points out that this candidate is a champion for employee rights and minimum wage, now he's engaged in this protected activity under the National Labor Relations Act, where this individual is seeking support from colleagues who may support this candidate who will enhance worker rights in the community. So bottom line, this tweet is probably protected under the NLRA, despite the fact that there was some suggestion that people who are not like-minded don't belong there. I think the NLRA would take a position that this was protected speech, particularly under the current constitution of the National Labor Relations Board under this new administration. I think they certainly would find that this was protected speech, and I would be inclined to agree with them.
Would this have been more acceptable, even though it's protected? Would it, been on any safer ground had it been had it had a different tone or used a different vocabulary? Is there a learning opportunity for employees here?
Yes, I absolutely do. And I do think that the employer could have a discussion, not a counseling, no discipline, but a counseling is not necessarily discipline. But say, hey, listen, of course, you're free to advocate for political candidates, especially those who are supporting worker rights. But please refrain from suggesting that your colleagues who don't agree with you don't belong here. They do belong here. So I think you can try to gently have that conversation. Perhaps you can even send a general memo around without even talking to this individual to say, we know a lot of you are tweeting, and if you're tweeting about advocating for certain candidates that are supporting workers' rights, we of course sanction that, and you're free to do that. But please refrain from disparaging people you work with or criticizing people who may not support you. But before you send out any message like that, you have to consult with legal counsel, employment counsel, because you don't want to find yourself getting charged with trying to stifle employee organizational activities. So it's a little fine line to walk, but I think you could send something very gently. But again, you got to have it cleared by legal counsel. Don't go that alone, because you can get tripped up very carefully and now find yourself on face of a charge of suppressing union activity or employee rights activity.
Great, thanks, Kathleen.
Unfair labor practice is what we call it.
Mm-hmm. I am going to accelerate us a little bit. We have about 15 minutes left in the session. Great discussion, but why don't we pick up with the New York Times example? In this case, a company's largest client noticed the employee, recognized him in a New York Times front page photo of protesters storming the Capitol and facing off against law enforcement. And Bill happened to be widely known in the industry, highly regarded by customers, but the client demanded that the company fire Bill, its VP of sales, and a $5 million account was at stake. Lisa and Kathleen, what are the implications here?
Lisa, I'll let you take it.
Well, this is a situation here where Bill is clearly engaging in violent behavior. If he's pushing a police officer, it's not just political speech. So in this situation, the employer, under any situation here, the employer would have the right to engage in some sort of adverse action, but especially given the fact that Bill is engaging in this sort of violent behavior. And I think the fact that the $5 million account is at stake is something, John, that is in your area of expertise that you can speak to, because I'm sure you've been faced with this type of situation before. They say, well, we can't, this is our biggest producer. What are we going to do if we lose our producer? Well, what we're going to be without business, and conversely, what message is that sending to the public if you don't take some sort of action?
Right. Well, the question is, do we lose our producer? And you're right. I've been in these circumstances, with companies whose primary rainmaker did some pretty icky and, unacceptable things. And company fears for their business, and they don't want to lose their rainmaker. They also don't want to lose big accounts if customers take a different point of view. So there's really a balancing act with this. And the question, I was asked this question in an online thread recently, and my view on this is, if an employee is seen in public, and a lot of the people who were involved on January 6th were posting selfies on social media. They were posting their own videos of themselves doing things. If an employee self-posts showing themselves engaged in unlawful conduct, the question is not whether or not the organization might take a position or take action based on perception of what they're doing and what they support or their political stance. To me, and tell me if I'm wrong on this, Lisa and Kathleen, to me, the issue is a lack of judgment that if the employee posts a video of themselves engaged in unlawful conduct in a public forum, the employer has a right to take action against them because they're putting the company's reputation and revenues at risk.
100%. I agree 100%.
It really, it's a totally different issue. It's no longer about what they believe or don't believe. It's the action itself and its business ramifications.
You're right. The lack of judgment, and we see a lot of that on social media these days, with employees getting into trouble because they're showing lack of judgment on what they think is appropriate to brag and boast about online. And there are a lot of employers who are saying, oh, that's great. You're proud of the fact that you got in the face of a police officer and shoved him, but that's a lack of judgment. You're clearly a person who is now bragging about the fact that you're a lawbreaker and we're part of a violent protest. I think it might be different if you had an employee who happens to be one of the people who got swept along with the wave, but they're not seen in any pictures engaging in any affirmative acts, but they just got swept up in the moment, depending on if they're contrite perhaps about it. But maybe that leads us to the next slide, perhaps.
Yeah, John.
Oh, go back.
No, I think you spoke to it. This is our second example here where Bill is not actually pushing a police officer, but simply attending what otherwise appears somewhat to be a peaceful rally. So I think certainly that distinction can be made.
Okay. So now when we talk about, what should you be considering when you think about this off-duty conduct and whether or not we're going to engage in any disciplinary action? Well, the first thing you have to think about, and John mentioned it, and I think we've all mentioned it, is there a relationship between the conduct and the performance of the employee's job in question? And we happen to have something that ripped from the headlines today. I don't know if you heard this morning, I was listening to the news, And there was a Senator, Neera Tanden, who was nominated for cabinet post, I think director of OMB. She happens to be a senator from Alaska, and up for a great position with the administration. Well, it turns out that she was very prolific with her tweets, and she had about 1,000 tweets that were very, very critical of Republicans, and some of them were very unkind. When she got nominated, she attempted to delete them all. However, during the confirmation proceedings, a lot of Republicans were saying, we're going to vote against her if that's how she feels about us. And one of the Senator Rob Portman made a statement saying, quote, "I wonder specifically, how do you plan to mend fences and build relationships with members of Congress you have attacked through your public statements?" He's making a good point there. If the point is we need to mend fences, now you've got this person in cabinet who's really disparaged a lot of them. Well, I think the pressure was put on by the administration, no doubt, put pressure on her, and she withdrew her nomination. So a clear example of where the tweets in question had a very direct connection with the job in question, and it made her not be considered. Second thing we want to consider, does the conduct put the business in an unfavorable light with clients or the general public? And the prime example of that is the pizza guy, okay? What does this have to do with pizza? And I'm sure he alienated a lot of clients and it put him in a bad light. Is the conduct unlawful? Clearly, if employees are engaged in unlawful conduct that gets caught on videos, such as smashing through a store window in the midst of a protest, that could certainly be taken under consideration. It's unlawful, and you have every right to act upon that and say, we don't like lawbreakers working for our company. It's a lack of judgment. Is the conduct against your own internal policies? You all have policies that prohibit discrimination, offensive comments, derogatory comments. If they're along those lines, you shouldn't be tolerating an employee making those kinds of comments on public media the same way that you wouldn't tolerate it if it's happening in the workplace. Another thing, though, I think you have to factor into this equation is also employee morale. And sometimes I think employers forget that part of it. You don't want to be too heavy-handed. We don't want to have what we're calling the big brother effect, where employees feel like the employer's trolling their social media websites, just looking for things to scold them about or sanction them about. I think it has to be measured, and I think you have to be ready to articulate how it's going to harm the business before you take action against it. And you're going to have a lot of employees coming to you about what other employees said. So I think you have to have a protocol in place as to determine when does it cross the line as to something we need to address as an employer, or when is it something that, well, what they do in their own time is their own business. I think you also have to be a little careful about having employees have a perception that, your company's all for diversity, but they have no diversity or tolerance of different thought processes. This is a situation where, maybe companies sanction individuals who engage in political speech that the employer does not appreciate, probably because they don't agree with it. And then those people can have a legitimate feeling that, well, gee, I get it. Unless I happen to agree politically, I'm an unwanted, I'm an undesirable here at this company. So that's something that you really have to factor into the equation before you're going to move forward with any form of discipline for off-duty conduct. And again, I can't stress it enough, you should always be seeking guidance of employment counsel before moving ahead with any of these situations.
And Lisa and Kathleen, moving on to our third area, you both talked about different aspects of policies and protocols and procedures. I mentioned in the opening the Whole Foods situation involving masks. Talk about, enforcing dress codes and those sorts of things, and where companies, may cross the line, or what are the bright lines employers need to be aware of?
Well, I think in this specific example, we kind of touched upon this with the political Hillary Clinton tweet. This is a situation where employers are going to have to make a decision as to whether or not they're going to allow their company platforms to be used for political speech. Are they going to allow it to be used for any political speech, certain social movements, or not allow it at all? And with this specific example, could we potentially have a reverse discrimination claim with the employee who was disciplined for wearing a Blue Lives Matter hat in violation of the dress code? Possibly. It's not as likely. What's more likely to take place is something we talked about. It's more likely to create this workplace friction where an employer is seen to be favoring one social movement while putting down or ignoring or objecting to what on its face is objectively a non-offensive social movement. So it's something that employers need to kind of navigate themselves. And are they going to take the position that you can't use a company platform to express a political position and in an effort to avoid offending anyone and to create this environment, a more team environment? Or are you going to pick and choose? I'm not sure that this is necessarily a legal issue, more as something that employers are going to have to kind of navigate themselves. I don't know, Kathleen, if you would agree.
No, absolutely. I think they have to seek counsel from somebody like John, somebody who has more of an idea how to gauge the pulse of the general public, and perhaps internally to decide whether or not it would be prudent to tread into these waters, or whether it might be better to just stay silent so as to not alienate people internally. Tough decision, very tough.
And I think really the big issue here, again, was self-inflicted, because as soon as the company made an exception to its standing dress code by allowing, masks with one logo versus all others, they were on a very slippery slope, and it's hard to recover. It's frankly impossible to recover from that, because and anything beyond that, if you say no to the next thing, you're being hypocritical.
Right. It's the unintended consequences, and you have to think through what they might be, because then you're stuck with them. Yeah,
Sure.
right.
Great. And our final hypothetical has to do with listening to the radio.
Kathleen, you want to take this one? You dealt with this one firsthand, right?
Yeah, this was a client who had this situation. I've changed it a little bit, but it was an individual who regularly streamed Fox News into her private office, and a colleague would occasionally go in to her office. And this was right before the election. That colleague went down to HR and said she found it offensive that her colleague was listening to Fox News. And in response, the company told her not to listen to her radio in the workplace. Now, there's a problem with that. Unless you're going to have a policy that says nobody can listen to radios in the workplace, it would be unfair to tell Susan that she can't listen to Fox Radio in the workplace. So you have to take a position on that, first of all. I think there's a lot better ways to approach this, however, because I know a lot of people listen to radios while they're working, myself included. I think you could call Susan into the office, and this is what I instructed the client to do. I said, and thankfully they didn't tell her not to. They called me first. They did the right thing. I said, look, why don't you issue a policy that says people are listening to radios in the workplace. We don't want to stifle political thought, but political discussions in the workplace and listening to politically bent radios in your offices, others might find it somewhat objectionable. We're not going to stop you from doing it. However, please don't play it so loudly that other people can hear it. And if someone comes into your office, please turn it down while they're in the office. And then when they leave the office, you may turn it a little louder if you want. And by all means, everyone has to be respectful. of each other when engaging and interacting in the workplace. So then we actually drafted a whole policy that was about political speech and political activities in the workplace that not only addressed listening to radio, it addressed political discussions and went a lot further. And I think we've come to the point in time when that might be a policy that we might want to see standard in any employee handbook.
Yeah, I would actually, take that a step further. And I think in so doing, you can avoid having to talk about not wanting to stifle, political interests, et cetera, and simply have a rule that says, if you are going, you are free to listen to whatever you wish in your office. Wear earbuds.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you could wear it. Yeah, that we suggested that
across the board.
Correct. Yeah. But sometimes wearing earbuds, then you're tuned out of other things. So I think it depends. If you have a private office, I think that's different. If you're out in a public space, then the earbuds. Some people might object to earbuds because then they feel like they can't go and approach you when you've got the earbuds in. Some people find that a little difficult. So I think it depends on the nature of the workplace and the office setting that you're dealing with.
And I think some of it seems so common sense, but at the end of the day, I agree. It should be formalized, and it pushes employers to sit down and really take all these things into consideration and put it into a formal policy. So they're getting ahead of any issues that may arise down the road, which brings us to our last slide.
Yeah, this is just some of the points that we'd like to see in a policy. And, employees need to understand that they need to keep their priorities in a proper balance, okay? The workplace is not meant to be your platform. That's not to say that you can't have some expression of speech in the workplace, but keep it in balance. And the employer has to consider whether they want to avoid getting into it, tipping into the waters, and advocating one viewpoint over another. You have to be concerned about public perceptions and employee perceptions if you as an employer decide to support a social movement that's out there. But you should have a clear policy that states what is and what is not allowed in your workplace. Can you wear insignia? Can you post political commentary? Can you put things up in the workplace that advocate one position over another? Or do you want to be in a position where you ban all those kinds of displays in the workplace? You have to be consistent. If you're going to ban, that means ban. That means you can't favor one speech over another if you're going to ban everything. If you're going to permit people to engage in political speech or activity in the workplace, what are its parameters? Now, if you're not going to ban all discussions, provide your employees with some guidance when they do engage in political speech in the workplace. You should be reminding them that at all times, under your policy, these discussions have to be polite, unthreatening, and respectful of others' views. And employees can be told, listen, if someone's engaging in a discussion and you don't agree with it, and you feel that you can't engage politely, then you can change the subject or you can retreat from the discussion. You can decline. You can tell people, I really don't want to participate in that discussion. And you can assure employees that they won't be subject to retaliation for having said they don't want to discuss the issue. But these are all things that should be included in a well thought out policy about expression of political or social issues in the workplace. And perhaps it's time to sit down and think whether the time is right to craft one that's suited for your workplace. And it's going to change. It's going to have, it's not a one size fits all policy. It's going to have to be, an intake on what is your workplace like? What kind of environment do you like to foster? What kind of work do you do? That's all going to have to factor into how stringent or how lenient your policy might be.
Sure. And that is a great point on which to end. I'll put this up as we close. Thank you both for your insight and for the lively discussion. If anyone has any questions going forward or thinks of something as soon as they click leave conference, you may want to just do a screenshot of this this slide. You have our emails, you have our numbers. I know I'm more than happy to discuss any specific reputational issues or concerns or challenges you may not want to have discussed in a public forum. And I know that Kathleen and Lisa feel the same way and are available to everyone on the call.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks very much for joining us and for the time. We hope it brought you value.
Thank you, everyone.